Cedar Point has 364 acres on a peninsula in Lake Erie in Sandusky, Ohio. The park is massive. If you've walked from the front to the back, you know what I mean. But the park is packed. Over 70 rides, 17 coasters. There's not a lot of unused space. We've seen new coasters come at the expense of other attractions, like when the Good Time Theater and Turnpike cars were removed for Valraven, or Disaster Transport for Gatekeeper. They were lucky to use Mean Streak's land and structure for the world-class Steel Vengeance. But what will they get next, and what will they need to sacrifice to get it? I'm turning my eyes to Gemini, their 1978 aerodynamics racing coaster. I'm a big fan of this coaster, and I know a lot of you are also. But I think its years are numbered as the park looks to make room for modern, state-of-the-art coasters. These are the top contenders to replace Gemini. Gemini sits on the northern side of the middle of the peninsula, but it's more on the eastern side of Cedar Point. Off to the east, you have Perimeter Road and the Soak City parking lot. To the west, you have the Midway and Pipe Scream, with a back area and Steel Vengeance to the north, and Magnum XL 200 to the south. There isn't much room around this plot to expand, but it does take up 885 feet at its longest and 224 feet at its widest. That's a huge plot of land, and Gemini's figure 8 layout occupies the whole thing. There are a lot of options that would fit here, but the question is, what do you get a park that seems to have everything? I always look at the chain that owns the park and ask two questions. Who does the chain work with, and what are they willing to spend for the park? The answer is Cedar Fair, and they will break the bank for their flagship park. I don't think anything is off limits when it comes to what Cedar Fair will spend on Cedar Point. Cedar Fair has recent dealings with B&M, Mock Rides, Gerstlauer, GCI, SNS, and RMC. Apparently, Cedar Fair's relationship with RMC is a little strained, but hopefully it's not beyond repair, like Six Flags with Gerstlauer. It's also worth mentioning that the wooden shuttle coaster that looked like it was planned for Dorney Park would likely be a Gravity Group, so they may start working with them also. Intamin seems like the only major manufacturer that seems unlikely. Now, let's look at Cedar Fair's gaps. For a park with 17 coasters and most of the elite new models on the market, there's not a whole lot that Cedar Fair could get and market to the public. They rarely get anything that isn't groundbreaking or record-breaking. The park needs a modern wooden coaster, but a simple GCI twister or a Gravity Group does not seem super marketable for Cedar Point. But just in case they wanted to, I found a pretty good comparable Gravity Group for this spot, and that's Cuchulainn at Tayto Park in Ireland. This stands 105 feet tall and has 3,590 feet of track, which is smaller and shorter than Gemini, and it also takes up less land, with 673 feet by 196 feet. A good fit here with room to spare if they wanted to make it taller and longer. As for GCI, I've been saying for years that Cedar Point would be a contender for their new dueling inverting wooden coaster. This would be a perfect modern upgrade to the dual-track Gemini, and with 2 stations and 2 tracks, it would have great capacity. This doesn't exist yet, but I can compare it to another dueling GCI without inversions, Lightning Racer at Hershey Park, which seems like a very good fit here, 810 feet by 322 feet. It fits lengthwise, but a little wide for the plot. Nothing that can't be taken care of with a custom layout. It does stand at just 92 feet tall, and each side features 3,393 feet of track. They may be able to go a little taller, but not much. The only thing I don't like about this idea is that it's a similar concept to Steel Vengeance. At least the general public will definitely see it that way, but it won't be as good. So I'm not super high on this idea, but I think it's possible. Cedar Fair's most recent coaster came courtesy of B&M, with Orion at Kings Island. But there's one B&M model that Cedar Fair has never purchased, and that's a flying coaster. We haven't seen a new one in America in over a decade, maybe because they're expensive and have a lot of mechanical issues. But B&M is still making these as of 2016, and this would be a perfect fit for the park and this spot. It's more of a long skinny plot, which doesn't work great for a flyer like the Superman clones. But maybe something in line with Flying Dinosaur at Universal Studios Japan would fit the plot better, and it could break records. Tallest, fastest, and longest flying coaster in the world sounds pretty good in a press release. Flying Dinosaur has a sprawling plot, 883 feet by 461 feet, nearly a perfect fit on length, but way too wide on width, so a custom model would tighten that up. Cedar Fair has not done any work with Vekoma since Kitty Hawk in 2003, but they may be looking to Germany and Phantasialand to build a custom launch flying coaster, and market that as the first one in the US. There's also the inversion record, which currently stands at 9 for North America, held by Steel Curtain, and 14 worldwide, held by the Smiler at Alton Towers. I could see Cedar Point working with SNS or Gerstlauer to try to top this record using Gemini's plot of land. Steel Curtain is also long and skinny, fitting easily here at 764 feet by 111 feet. This type of coaster would also give the park the height to brag about, yet another coaster topping 200 feet, with as many inversions as they want. The Smiler has 5 more inversions, but it's much shorter and more compact, standing on a plot just 372 feet by 133 feet, but isn't very impressive, other than just having tons of inversions. Cedar Point may work with Gerstlauer for a coaster the size and scale of Carnan at Hansa Park, but with the inversion record. They may still have some space left over to use for anything else they want to do. You can't talk about Cedar Point without talking about an RMC T-Rex, the upscale single-rail model that's still in development. RMC indicated that this model is on hold until someone shows interest in buying one. RMC says that these can exceed 500 feet in height, and since Cedar Point broke the 200, 300, and 400 foot barrier, this could be their ticket to do it again. Gemini's land is 885 feet long, and Railblazer's 106 foot tall lift hill takes up about 126 feet of land. So if you extend that by 5 to get over the 500 foot mark, you're looking at using 640 feet for the lift. That still leaves 245 feet to spare, and that's assuming the lift angle would be the same, which it probably wouldn't. If they wanted to build a T-Rex on one plot of land and not have it sprawl out all around the park and go over pathways, this seems like a great spot to do it. They just have to make friends with RMC again to make this happen. Speaking of manufacturers that Cedar Fair has problems with, let's look at possible Intamin models. Cedar Point was loaded up with Intamins between 2000 and 2007, with 4 installed. But after the failure of Shoot the Rapids, we've seen B&M and RMC share the new projects at the park. If Cedar Point wanted a single rail model and the T-Rex wasn't available, and the Raptor seems too low capacity, maybe Intamin can step in and give Cedar Point their first dueling hot racer. We know from the Intamin concept video that this was meant to duel, but the first one going to Luna Park in Sydney will be a single track on its own. The hot racer could carry on the spirit of Gemini with the dual tracks, and feature a long, extreme, twisted, and intertwined dueling experience with multiple launches on each track. And since it's so important with a park like Cedar Point, the capacity would be solid, with 2 tracks and at least 4 trains on each one. Let's throw out a couple wildcards before I get to my last real possibility. One is the SNS Axis Coaster. If you've watched this series, you know I love bringing up the Axis. The only one I didn't talk about it for was Anaconda at King's Dominion, and some people think they actually are going to get an Axis to replace Volcano, and the 2021 free spin was part of a package with SNS. It's such an interesting concept, and I can see SNS selling several of these to other smaller parks or Six Flags parks before Cedar Fair takes that next step and they get the biggest, tallest, and fastest one. They didn't get the first Intamin Mega, but they got the upgraded version with Millennium Force. They didn't get the first B&M Invert, but they got the biggest one with Raptor. They didn't get the first Intamin Impulse, but they got the biggest one with Wicked Twister. They didn't get the first Intamin Accelerator, but they got the tallest and the fastest one with Dragster. They didn't get the first Dive Coaster, but they got the biggest one with Valraven. They didn't get the first RMC, but they got the biggest and baddest one with Steel Vengeance. If Gemini hangs on for another 5 years or so, and we see some Axis coasters pop up and they're successful, don't be surprised to see Cedar Point and SNS push the boundaries away from the prototype and build something crazy. The other wildcard is the B&M Surf Coaster. At first, people thought this was a weird stand-up coaster where the riders face sideways, but now people think it's B&M's version of an Intamin Blitz. With as much as Cedar Fair works with B&M as of late, something like this could be possible. But I would expect something like that to fit in better at Canada's Wonderland anyway. Plus, they serve as Cedar Fair's testing ground. One last possibility, and this is one that I wouldn't bring up for just about any other American park. This is the SNS Fourth Dimension Coaster. The only one in America is X2, built by Aerodynamics. But when they went out of business, SNS took the mantle and built Aijonaika at Fuji-Q Highland and Dinoconda at China Dinosaurs Park. These are some of the most extreme coasters ever, but only 3 exist. This is probably due to the high price tag, but with Cedar Fair's budget and their desire to build the most extreme coasters, this is a real possibility. SNS hasn't built one in 9 years, but unless they took it off the market, I think they would entertain building a new custom model. Aijonaika was made for Gemini's plot of land, 891 feet by 246 feet, exceeding the area by 6 feet in length and 22 feet in width. Ijanica is 249 feet tall and 3,783 feet long, and it would be one of the greatest and most extreme coasters in the country. I would say it may be too extreme for the general public for Cedar Fair to want to invest in, but X2 at Magic Mountain always has a huge line, and that's pushing 20 years old. I want this to happen, and I really hope that Cedar Fair and Cedar Point make it happen. But as for the most likely option to replace Gemini, the S&S 4D is not sitting at the top of that list. I would rank the top 3 like this. Number 3 is the B&M or Vekoma Flyer. I think it's a perfect fit for the park, and there isn't anything like it nearby. Just that great adventure in Great America. But the fact that the B&M model seems to be falling out of style, and Cedar Fair doesn't really have a relationship with Vekoma, makes me think this is more of a long shot. Number 2 is the Dueling GCI Inverting Coaster. Since Cedar Fair has worked with them recently, and this would be a people eater, and it would be marketable, especially with inversions, and the park needs a new wooden coaster. And number 1 is the S&S or Gerstlauer that would smash the inversion record. American parks haven't really focused much on inversion-based coasters. With all of the 10 inversion coasters in Europe and Asia, we didn't even break the 7 inversion mark until Steel Curtain in 2019. But I still think Cedar Point can make a splash by setting the American record with 10, or the world record with 15. It wouldn't be overly expensive, and it could be easily done on Gemini's plot. Once again, I love Gemini more than most people do, but I just see this as a coaster nearing the end of its service life. When Intamin and Cedar Point were designing Dragster, the rumor was that it was going to have to cross the Midway and use Gemini's plot of land for the top hat. But Intamin was able to fit it on its current plot, and Gemini has lived on for another couple decades. Let me know what you think that Cedar Point could replace Gemini with, or just in general, what will Cedar Point's next coaster be? This has really been a tough topic for me to consider because they already have so much, and they always seem to get something that they can market as a record setter. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like. That's the best way to show your support for the channel. And if you're new here, be sure to subscribe for more coaster content just like this. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.